Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Author Talks. It's so great to see you all back here again. We also have a lot of new guests in the audience tonight, so I welcome you to History Author Talks. And we have, as usual, if you've been with History Author Talks before, you'll know that you'll use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen to ask questions, and when we get to the question and answer period, I will certainly do my best to get to everybody's questions. So I welcome you all here. I will also be putting the link to the bookshop.org, which has a place where you can purchase our guests' books, and with proceeds being that will benefit the SAR Library and Genealogical Research Center, or you can get her books anywhere books are sold. So you see her right here on the screen. So I would like to welcome you all and welcome our guest, Nancy Rubin Stuart. Nancy is an award-winning author and journalist whose 8 nonfiction books focus on women and social history. Her most recently published works include Defiant Brides, the untold story of 2 revolutionary era women and the radical men they married, The Muse of the Revolution, The Secret Pen of Mercy Otis Warren, and the Founding of the Nation. Nancy is a former journalist. She's written for the New York Times, the Huffington Post, the New England Quarterly, and other national magazines. She serves as the executive director for the Cape Cod Writers Center. And you can connect with Nancy at her website, www.nancyrubinstuart.com. Welcome, Nancy Stuart. It's great to have you with us this evening.
Thank you, Roger. It's a privilege and an honor to be here.
So before we get into the meat of the book, I wanted to let everybody know that tonight, I'm sort of calling this today's Ben Franklin Day, because at 8 o'clock this evening Eastern Time is the first showing of PBS's Ken Burns documentary on Ben Franklin. And Nancy was brilliant 5 years ago to time the publication of her book on the pretty much the exact same week as the Ken Burns program. So I congratulate her certainly for that. But because we all want to not only hear about Poor Richard's women, and we will indeed get quite a story that you're going to hear, we're going to end 5 minutes early tonight at 7:55 so that you all have a chance to get your glass of wine and watch the Ken Burns special this evening. So with that, I would love for Nancy to show us and tell us a little bit. She's got a little bit of show and tell here. So we're going to start with Nancy telling us a little bit about her book. I have some questions. I will tell you, I have already read this marvelous book, but let's hear from Nancy. Nancy, first, became a big fan of yours with your book Defiant Brides and the Mercy Otis Warren book, which were absolutely fascinating. Tell us about Poor Richard's Women and Deborah Franklin.
Yes, well, actually, I started working on this book 26 years ago, and nobody was particularly interested in Deborah Franklin at the time, Deborah Read Franklin, because, well, the historians up until quite recently have painted her as a rather ignorant, stupid, uneducated woman that really wasn't worthy of Ben, that, you know, he had far surpassed her. So nobody really cared. And so I worked on the book, I put it away, and then I worked on it again for a while. And then finally I put it in the back drawer. And about 6 years ago, I said, well, I think maybe I really have to get to this book. And that's how it began. So fortunately, Beacon Press, which had published the last 2 books, had said, well, we'd love you to do that about Deborah, but we'd also like you to include other women. So
Good.
That's where I was. Yep.
Excellent. So, if you could set the scene for us, because while many, many, many books have been written about Ben Franklin, for those who have not had an opportunity to read your book yet, tell us a little bit about Deborah.
Yes, well, Deborah, well, it's in my little slide presentation, but Deborah did meet Ben at an early age. They were both teenagers, and she went on from there. It's a long story, but middle-class colonial women in Philadelphia, anyway, they were taught to read and write, and of course some computing, but not necessarily spelling. And she was not taught spelling. So when you read her letters, they are, they're phonetic and they're very difficult to read. And I think that's one of the reasons that her letter, this opinion has arisen about her. And of course, we are missing a lot of her letters for the first 5 years of Ben's absence, from when he was in first, that was the second time technically that he was in England, but during his mission for the pens.
Sure.
From 1757 to 63, actually. Yep.
Well, you had given me a little bit of a preview of some of the illustrations. Why don't you show the audience what you have?
Okay. Be patient with me on this. Okay. So, Ben admired women. He loved them, but, he found them sort of as shocking as electricity itself. And that is really one of the underlying themes of Poor Richard's Women. So you all know about Ben Franklin. You're going to hear still more in the next few days via Ken Burns, but briefly we think about him with electricity and the kite and the key and the experiment and his genius as a scientist and an inventor. And of course, we think about him in terms of being a statesman, signing the Declaration of Independence and many other things. And we also hear about him as the ultimate pragmatist. And of course, these are some of the famous maxims that we always hear. And remember that these were, if not written originally by Ben, certainly they would change by his pen before he created, or while he created Poor Richard's Almanac. And of course, here it is. And here again are some of again, they all sound like this man is very pragmatic, reason and logic over emotion, discretion above all things. And these are just a few of them. There's really hundreds of them in the almanacs, which go from 1733 to 1756, actually.
Now, we don't see the slides yet. Do you?
You don't see the slides, so we're back to that. That's a shame. Okay, let's go back. Try again. I'm going to get out of that if I can. Try it again. One more time. Let me try again. Okay. So sorry.
Oh, that's quite all right. We this in our Zoom world, this is what we all have to put up with.
Okay. We had it before. Just bear with me one moment. We had it before, Roger, so we'll get back to it somehow, I hope.
All right, well,
let me try to open it. Of course, it wouldn't be working now. We just rehearsed it. It did. Naturally. Well,
all right. So why don't we do it without the slides, Nancy?
Okay.
Unless
That's a shame. Unless I can get this thing to work properly. I'm going to waste time on this, and I don't really want to. Okay, I don't know why it isn't working now.
Well, let's press forward. All
right.
I've got some questions of my own, and as we move forward, if you happen to figure it out, maybe we'll look at them a
Well,
little bit later.
yeah.
So the first question that I have is,
Okay.
how did Deborah Read personify the 18th century wife? And conversely, how did she break the mold of the 18th century woman?
Well, yes, she certainly personified her because she was obedient to him. Deborah was not really an obedient person. She was really very feisty and sociable and warm, and she knew everyone in Philadelphia. She grew up there, came there at an early age, and but she loved Ben, and of course, typical of colonial women, she was taught to be subservient to her man, her master, she even calls him that. And so even in the very beginning, she had the advantage. Her mother had an ointment business. Her mother became widowed, and she must have learned bookkeeping and skills to do with that, because as soon as she moved in with Ben, and of course it was a common law marriage, at that point, she immediately took over his stationery shop and she turned it into a very flourishing general store. She expanded the goods, and she just took it over and made it very popular and profitable. And before long, she was also helping him with his finances. And he does talk about that. He talks about how he was fortunate that she assisted me much by attending the shop, and that he was very lucky because he found in her a frugal woman who thereby became a fortune to me. And he does admit, throughout here and there, Ben doesn't say a lot about her in his autobiography, but here and there he does talk about her as if having been really responsible for a lot of help with his finances and with the postmastership. In fact, when he was to leave to England on 1757, he told William Dunlop, who was to take over the post office, he had better listen to Mrs. Franklin, because she had a great deal of experience in the post office, and she was known to be able to change money from different colonies in different countries. And he does continue to depend on her, even early in their marriage, when he has to leave on a trip out of Pennsylvania, out of the colony. He assigns Deborah the power of attorney. That is extraordinary for a colonial woman. And he does that again much later in life. So you see, she really was much more than just the obedient person. And it's funny because at one point, he starts the marriage 6 weeks in. He talks about, he promotes this rules and maxims for promoting marital happiness in the Pennsylvania Gazette. And the basic message is directed to women, because women, of course, could be the ones who would listen to this and would take this in. And the message is basically that women should obey their husbands. Well, a few years later, he, having lived with Deborah for a while, he now writes in the Pennsylvania Gazette about the virtues of a scolding wife, and how she's going to be strong-willed, and she's going to be smart, and she's going to take over things, and she's going to bear smart, and strong children. So he's already rationalizing that this woman that he's married is not exactly going to be obeying him on everything.
Well, so much of, obviously, Poor Richard's Women revolves around Deborah Franklin. I just jumped right in. I've learned so much from her in reading this book. I should have really started a little bit more at the beginning. Tell us how they met. What was the courtship? Tell us about their beginnings.
Sure. Well, Ben, being printer's apprentice to his brother for the New England Courant, was not happy about that. Felt his brother whipped him and didn't treat him the way he should be getting special treatment as a brother. So Ben eventually, and also Ben detested the Puritan sort of overlay and all the authorities, and he was writing saucy, anonymous letters in the Courant anyway. So he was not exactly popular in Boston, and he fled. Ultimately, he ran away. He became, a runaway, a fugitive, which was looked upon, from colony to colony as somebody rather suspect. Nevertheless, he arrived in Philadelphia and he was dirty, disheveled. He had been traveling for 2 weeks. He didn't have any clothes. Those would come in a trunk by sea. And the first time Deborah saw him, he was walking down Market Street near her home. Her father was the carpenter, John Read, and he had 2 rolls under one arm, and he was ravenously devouring another one. And her first reaction, he says in his autobiography, that she laughed, that she giggled at him. Well, let's flash forward a few months, and once again he appears at her father's house, and this time she's sort of stunned because he's well groomed, he's well dressed, he has a job with Keimer, the sort of crotchety printer in town, and he asked John Read if he could rent a room, and he does, and that is how they begin. And he, as he admits, Ben, never in high points or emotional points in his life ever really goes too deep. He always tends to gloss over this in all of his writings, his letters, as well as his autobiography. So as he put it, he admired and respected Miss Read, and he had every reason to believe she did him too. And then he writes a little later, he made courtship to her. And so before long, they were betrothed to be married. However, there was a governor who had ulterior motives and promised Ben he'd set him up in his own printing shop. Of course, he was going to use him as an instrument for his own means. And so he said he promised him he would send him to England and pay for the voyage and pay for the printing equipment. And Ben fell for it, and off he went. And only to discover when he arrived in England, there were no letters of credit, and his voyage was not paid for. He had to borrow the money. And there was no way to buy the printing equipment. So he was there for almost a year. And now he wrote to Deborah. He was taken with London. A friend was staying with him, and they were gallivanting around. And he wrote to Deborah. He said he didn't know when he'd be back. He wouldn't be back anytime soon. Now, Deborah was horrified. And her mother, it seems, from what we get from the autobiography, was her mother pushed her to not hang around and just wait. Could be indefinite, that really she should accept, other suitors. And so she did. And by August of 1725, she was married to an English emigre, a man named, he was a potter, John Rogers, and but within 2 months of their marriage, 2 months or so, somebody explained on good account that he actually was married he had a wife, and he had a child in England. And Deborah, that's all she needed to know. Off she went back, stayed with her mother. That was it. End of the marriage. She wouldn't take his name. That was the end of it. However, John Rogers had her dowry, and John Rogers, I don't know what his deal was, but anyway, he lost that money, and he lost some other money, and he was in deep debt. And ultimately, after a number of months, he fled to, we think, the Barbados. And then there were rumors that he died over there. This left Deborah, all of it, in a very strange position. She was neither single nor married. She couldn't get a divorce. And there she was. And unlike all her girlfriends who were getting married and having children, she was sort of left on the side. Deborah was a very social, vibrant person, many friends, and lots of energy. But by the time Ben came back in 1726, he was horrified because she was depressed. She was not social. She was just forlorn. I guess he felt guilty. We don't hear about that till later. And meanwhile, he is very busy. First, he's working back with the printer after being in business shortly, back with the printer. Then he starts his own printing company, and he's also courting other women. Now, I should say, and the order of this may be wrong because he admits he's writing this biography, the first part of this autobiography, 40 years after the event, while he's in England. But he writes that, at one point he had started as a young man to socialize, meet with low women, end quote, quote unquote. And we don't know where. Well, many scholars think this probably was in England. But anyway, he's back now in Philadelphia, and he's courting these other women, and the fathers want nothing to do with him, middle-class fathers, because they say a printer makes no money. So they don't want somebody who's a poor provider for their daughter. So he doesn't get very far with that, but he does eventually own his own print shop. His partner is asked to leave for various reasons. Mostly he was an alcoholic. And Ben has his own print shop. And he continued, by the way, to be friendly with the Reeds. He said he'd been their neighbor, he'd been living in their home, and he said that Mrs. Reed, who had been widowed for a long time now, would ask his advice. I presume it's financial advice. So in the summer of 1730, he tells Mrs. Reed, he confesses, his first time we hear about guilt, that he feels very guilty about Deborah. It's really his fault because he'd put her off so long. And Mrs. Reed is, to her credit, she said, well, it's really my fault too, because she had pushed Deborah to get married. So September 1st, anyway, Ben writes, so I took her to wife, meaning Deborah, on September 1st, 1730. Well, of course, it was a common law marriage. And that's how it went for the next 43 years that they were married. Common law marriages, they were not uncommon.
Right.
Many people, that was the way it was. And nobody objected. Well, there were a few objections, but nobody really objected. And for all practical purposes, she was Mrs. Franklin.
So, and children come into the picture.
Well,
Give us the highlight.
6 months after Deborah is married, Ben arrives home with a blanket, and inside that blanket is a little baby boy. And he presents it to Deborah, and Deborah is stunned. And he says, this is my son. And she is not happy about this. He wants her to bring up this child, and who is the mother? Well, we never know who the mother is. There's all kinds of theories and have been written whole chapters on that. Some people, and poor Ben is taunted with this for the rest of his life, that he was this lecherous person, he was this low-lying person, that, he had this illegitimate son, all this. So was it a prostitute? Well, many scholars, including Leo LeMay, believe that this child was probably not the child of a prostitute, because if it had been, Ben didn't need to claim it as his child. Probably was a woman of a somewhat higher class. Maybe her husband was away at sea for a long time, or away on a trip. We don't know, certainly a long time. But in any case, she couldn't keep the baby. So there was Deborah. And the child is called William, or as they called him, Billy. Billy later grows up to become the governor of New Jersey, and of course becomes a Tory. But anyway, Deborah is faced with all of the chores of a colonial wife, and helping with the shop and the business and the finances. And she's always having new relatives of mostly Ben's family come and visit, and entertaining them for weeks on end. She's busy. Her mother has moved in with them. And it takes, she soon, after several years, she finally has her own child, a little boy that they call Frankie. And he is the apple of Ben and Deborah's eye. And he evidently very bright and very winning. They even have a portrait painted of him, one little portrait. And they even have him tutored starting at the age of 2. That's, I guess, how proud or intelligent they thought he was. And that's all fine. But of course, Ben in the Pennsylvania Gazette was forever warning the Philadelphians about smallpox, the epidemics in Boston in particular, and advocating, because Ben was a product of the Enlightenment, that it was important for them to get inoculated. This was not with a needle, of course. It was a much more primitive form of inoculation. But he was advocating this, and he had, of course, Ben always kept records and statistics and lists and everything else and scientific observations. And of course, he kept, statistics on how many were inoculated, how many survived, and kept pointing that out in his newspapers. But his son, when he was almost 4, 1736, becomes ill with dysentery, which is a terrible disease, and too sick for Ben to inoculate him. And so the child dies. This is of everlasting sorrow to Ben and to Deborah. And Deborah, it is said, always displayed in a prominent place this little portrait of Frankie. Now, 7 years go by. She's working side by side with Ben, and they are slowly becoming very well-to-do. And of course, in 1736, I think it is, he is appointed the postmaster of Philadelphia. He's also becomes the clerk, I may have the dates at 36, 37. He becomes the the clerk to the assembly. So he's already very involved in government and civic affairs. And of course, this man is, his overarching goal in life is for civic and personal improvement of mankind. This is what really, I believe, drives him more than anything else. And he's already had created, the beginnings of a lending library. He has formed what was called the Leather Apron Club, which soon becomes the junto of young men, not all tradesmen. Many of them were beyond that, more educated men. And eventually this leads into, intellectual sort of and civic organization, thought and action to create a better Philadelphia. And eventually, of course, this becomes the beginnings of what would become the American Philosophical Society, founded in 1743. But that's not enough. He's also involved with a lending library. He's beginning to start a fire prevention, a fire company. He's thinking about getting the roads paved and illumination. He begins to think about academy. He's beginning to have a lot more free time because he really has become a media mogul. He owns paper mills. Deborah, by the way, collects rags for papers. We hear about that a little bit in his autobiography. And he has, imitation or little gazettes in several other colonies. And he's become quite involved in government and reform, all kinds of activities. A man is a whirlwind of activity. And he's so wealthy by the 1740s, he's ready to retire. Now, Deborah doesn't have a child for these 7 years. And historians, I think, have used this to say, well, she was barren or he didn't want to be near her or anything. But my theory is probably she had a number of stillborns or miscarriages. Ben writes, when he invents his furnace, the Franklin furnace, he writes about middle-aged women that, middle-aged to him was like in their mid-30s, I guess. Women were getting wrinkles from, they were sitting by the fireplace too long and they were always cold and sick. So, you wonder what her, how that all fed into probably there were miscarriages or stillborns. We don't know, but we begin to think about those things. And it isn't until 1743 that she has Sally. And that's right around the time Ben starts serious experimentation with electricity.
So in school, we all learn so much about the founding fathers, and much of history is his story as opposed to her story. Explain how historians have portrayed Deborah. You mentioned earlier that she's sort of seen as this sort of simple, irrelevant person. And you have written about Peggy Shippen and Lucy Flucker and Mercy Otis Warren and now Deborah Franklin. What challenges do you encounter in looking for sources of your narrative?
Well, there are a lot of challenges. There are really relatively few 18th century written correspondence from women. Not that many could write, but that's so history is always written by the people who are the conquerors and the elite and the powerful and the literate. And in 18th century, there just aren't that many, relatively speaking, women who have left voluminous correspondence enough that one could even begin to delve into their lives. And the characters you mentioned that I've written about, all of them did. And by the way, Peggy Shippen and Lucy Flucker and Mercy Otis Warren and Abigail Adams, they were literate. More than literate, they were sophisticated and very well educated. So their writing is pretty good and it's fine now, but certainly not Deborah. Deborah's writing is phonetic and vernacular, and it looks pretty bad. I can understand why historically she's sort of been neglected or tossed aside. But when you look further and you are able to look at those letters and you're able to piece together some of that, and you look at, for instance, the American Philosophical Society has ledger books in which some of her notes are there. You begin to see, you begin to get another picture of this woman. Even at that point now, we don't have early letters, but we do have some accounts from other people about her as well.
But the mere fact that Ben Franklin had spent time away, I mean, he was a successful everything, statesman and scientist and inventor. But the mere fact that he was away, both in England and traveling through to the other colonies and other conferences and other colonies, that he had this correspondence with Deborah, which is why you were able to, at least misspellings notwithstanding, and in your book, it's marvelous to read some of these letters and the way they're spelled. But of course, I guess it was Ben Jonson who said you're not an educated man unless you know how to spell a word at least 6 ways or something like that.
That was before spelling was regulated.
Right, exactly. But so if Deborah loved Ben so deeply in her later letters, as her later letters indicate, why didn't she accompany him on any of these trips?
That's a very good question. And of course, when I started this book, my early question was, well, if they're so affectionate, why did she spend first 5 years away from him? Then he came back for a few years. Then she spent the next 10 years until she died. She never saw him again. Why did this happen? How could this be? What is it? Is this some kind of an 18th century version of divorce or legal separation? Did they just agree that this is what? So it's not quite like that. So lots of theories. Again, there are 101,000 books that have been written on Benjamin Franklin, and there are almost 30,000 letters. So, all right, let's move this. Let's move this on. Answer the question here. Some historians believe, because she came over in 1711 as a very young child with her parents from Birmingham, England, on a perilous journey. Early 18th century voyages were dangerous and dirty and filthy, and there were threats of pirates and disease and shipwrecks and bad storms and hunger and seasickness. So they think, at least one of the theories is that, she remembers this traumatic crossing as a very young child, and she doesn't want to cross the ocean again. That's one theory. Another theory is that she was frightened, as in, again, we're looking at her from the older image of her as an ignorant provincial woman, that she felt inadequate and she would not have fit in with the cultured people of London, that she would be ashamed of how she was. And so she refused to go. But I have to say, Ben kept asking her, and we'll get to that in a minute. But there's another theory, which is that even during that first voyage, when he went in 1757, she had a certain stature in Philadelphia. She had been well known as somebody, obviously had run the shop and helped in the other aspects of Ben's financial dealings. She helped in the post office. She was well known. She was active in the Christ Church. Her daughter, Sally, is growing up, is still a child. She has friends, by the way, from childhood who are members of the elite. And there are accounts of female dignitaries, particularly a matron for the British soldiers who came to visit, and how Mrs. Franklin was among them and was very gracious, and even hosted her in her carriage, bringing her back and forth. So she had a lot of status already, and perhaps, and maybe this is looking at it through a feminist lens, perhaps she felt that she had, sort of a more comfortable and secure existence because of who she was. Maybe she had a sense, which I think she did, of who she was, to stay in Philadelphia. And of course, she and Ben both agreed that first trip was only going to last 6 months, which of course it ended up being 5 years.
So much of what our modern sensibility of Ben Franklin is the First Continental Congress and the second, the Congress and the Revolutionary War, and this grandfatherly figure who was always chasing after women. But really, the bulk of his fame came during their marriage from the 1730s all the way up to through the French and Indian War and up into the Revolutionary War era. And when he travels to France to take over for Silas Deane's work in France, well, it becomes a real party time for him. He's a world-renowned celebrity, probably one of the first world-renowned celebrities of his time. And well, he's got quite a few lady callers and vice versa. When Ben's flirtations with his French, were these flirtations with these French women serious, or as some historians claim, were these romances merely just his parlor games?
Yes, again, it's a subject of great debate, and most male historians I have seen have passed it off as just that these were charming. They were really games of wit, if you will, repartee, and they really didn't mean very much. There are funny things. There are reports that sort of drifted back to America, how when Ben greeted some of these French women, not necessarily just the two that he became involved with, that he would kiss their necks, and Americans were horrified. And then he had to explain this was the custom at that time in Paris, because the women did not want to have their makeup ruined. So he would kiss them on the neck. And this was de rigueur. But these all contribute to this attitude, this reputation he has. But these two women that he had romantic relationships with were, as I read through the letters and studied them and so on both sides, these were sincere on his part. He with both of them, first was young Madame Brillon, who was 33, a gifted musician, an expert on the new pianoforte, so gifted that Boccherini had devoted his 6th piano sonata to her. She was married, arranged marriage to a wealthy man. She had 2 children, and nevertheless, she was shameless. She sat on his lap in public. She had over 100 letters, by the way, and she proclaims her everlasting love, and she's continually she's tying him up on Wednesdays and Saturdays with dinners and salon meetings and concerts and chess games and strolls on her estate and so on and so forth. And he completely falls in love with her. And you read those letters between them, and he becomes very frustrated when she will not grant him the last favor. And of course, she says, no, and he's stung. And then he says, well, that means I can be with other women. And she's even more furious, and she tries to tie him down and keep him all for herself. And he's in his 70s, so people say, well, who would want? He's bald, he's fat, he has gout, he's limps sometimes, he has boils, he has a series of complaints. But he's really very engaging and charming and caring and dutiful. So plus he's famous. And of course, very, very important in terms of he's a statesman. So the women are after him. It kind of goes on. He does finally meet again another woman. She's a widow, and she's quite unconventional. Madame Helvetius, her former husband, had been a philosopher, a rather eccentric one. But anyway, she's even more eccentric. She gets rid of her townhouse in Paris, and she buys this estate in a nearby village of Auteuil, and she fills the gardens with a menagerie of birds and beasts and who knows what in her house. In her estate, she has 18 cats running around, and she's very famous as the hostess of a highly regarded salon with some of the leading philosophers of pre-Enlightenment, of the Enlightenment of pre-revolutionary France. And he's completely intrigued with her. And she also has 3 single men who live with her, and they kind of keep track of her. Well, she's not very organized, so they keep track of her social engagements. And it doesn't always work. There are several times when Ben, as he puts it, he washed, he clothed, he dressed, he coiffured, he got in his carriage, he came for dinner, and voila, she wasn't there. She'd forgotten she's in Paris on some other event. And it's all very amusing. And they have wonderful repartee. Again, he becomes more and more involved with her. She leads him on, I have to say that. But again, but she does also say with Franklin, and she teases him. She says, "Oh, you have a sore shoulder. Well, what is that? Because you were outside somebody's window with your guitar strumming, and declaring your love." I mean, she's on to him as kind of a ladies' man, a roving eye, kind of a character. So, but he's serious about it. He wants to marry her. Why does he want to marry her? Well, lots of theories. Again, he's in his mid-70s, late 70s. He's very worried that he's going to be alone in France, in a foreign country, when he becomes older and infirm. He keeps writing when he brought his two grandsons along with him. He needed somebody there to close his eyes when he died. So he proposes to her, not once. We think about many times. Again, it's kind of cloaked in allusions to it. And finally, he becomes so insistent that she becomes frightened. Madame Helvetius becomes frightened. I don't know. And she takes off for 3 months to tours. And it's Turgot, who was her close friend and a friend of Franklin too, the economist Turgot says, well, it's just to make him calm down and sort of make this into a friendship rather than a love affair. And and again, let's come back to that question, Roger. He was sincere. And it's after he finally, after they finally get the treaty with Great Britain, that he decides to go back to Philadelphia for his last years.
So our image of this playboy 70-year-old bouncing around France, I guess Ben Franklin, the musical, would have him dancing around with all the dancing girls of France, but it's not like that at all. It's really these very deep and intellectual women that he has these relationships with. So there really weren't a lot of other paramours flying around all over the place. It was
no, and you see some of these things, especially on the internet. He had 12 illegitimate children. He did all this. I mean, it's just ludicrous. I guess it's sensational. This was a serious man, and the women that he became romantically involved with, starting with a flirtation he had back in Boston when he came to visit Boston with a young woman who was 23 when he was 48. Is also a very intelligent, educated, sophisticated young woman. And these women in France were, and also I should mention that when he lived in England, he lived with Margaret Stevenson, and we don't know a lot about her. She was a middle-class widow. She seems to be a lot like Deborah, just a little more sophisticated, but equally shy about her writing, by the way. So again, this was probably women of a certain era, but her daughter, Polly, was very bright and sophisticated and educated, and he loved to teach her and talk to her and encourage her, and eventually he really begins to behave like her surrogate father. So as you said, these weren't just casual one-night stands or anything. These are women that he connected with that were real, and they were intelligent and important, and he had sincere relationships with them.
For somebody like me who reads, I don't know, book after book, I have no idea how many books I've read on the American Revolution, but most of it is military history. I certainly read a lot of political history. I read a lot of the writings of Enlightenment and the founding of our Constitution. And I don't really have as much opportunity to be able to really read about the lives of the colonial women. I mean, there's been some marvelous books written about women of the era. In reading Poor Richard's Women, I go through the entire Revolution without even the mention of a battle. I mean, it's quite
well. There are a few mentions, but
Well,
okay.
yeah, exactly. But it,
No big descriptions, no.
sure. But the point that I wanted to make and the question that I have is that while we look at the founding era as this transformation in humankind of the American self-determination in government, the women of the colonies, and particularly the women of these founding fathers, as we call them, were very much a part of how we formed as a early nation. What can you tell us about Deborah, and how she may have had any influence on Ben Franklin during this era of the Continental Congress? And I mean, was there anything in your research that where he had conversations with her about what was going on?
Actually, she knows what's going on, and in fact, she is unfortunately embroiled in some controversies that occur during the beginning of the French and Indian War, with the battles involving the pens, in which she is sort of dragged through smeared as being, the terrible things. So she knows about all these things very, very carefully and closely. And when he is in England, she does write to him. I mean, he responds. Again, I don't have those first letters. I have later ones. And he says, I'm not going to talk to you about what's happening in my meetings with the pens. I'm not going to talk politics with you. And I don't, because I'm worried about spies. So she's fully aware to a point. But he sometimes says, look, don't listen to those rumors that you're hearing about the talks have collapsed or anything like that. There's a curtain that's drawn over that. However, just to remind you, in the book and in quite vivid descriptions from the letters during the Stamp Act, when he is obedient to appoint a stamp collector before the riots become big on time. It's a time lapse, between letters crossing the sea by several months. So the Americans the patriots have misinterpreted this. And at one point, they are going to storm the new house that he has half built with Deborah. She's really finished the construction plans on it and everything else. And they're going to storm the house. And there's a mob, a really ugly mob, and she calls for help from her brother, and she defends the house with a gun. She writes about this to him, or somebody does. So I mean, she's closely involved in politics, but like all women at that time, she will reflect them more than change them. But I have to say that oddly enough, one of the French women, Madame Brillon, it is through her a chance occurrence when she is in she's in France. She's in the south of France recovering in Nice from an illness with her family, that she meets somebody who's quite influential, an Englishman who's quite influential with trying to obtain this treaty. And she introduces him, through letters to Franklin. And sure enough, within a month or two, he's at Franklin's door. And it's through those connections that finally, thankfully, he's able to finally negotiate a treaty to end the British treaty with a surrender. The final treaty, the peace treaty. So, the women know about these things, but they must be reflective. There's no other way.
So we have a question from Catherine in the audience who asks,
yes.
Why couldn't Deborah get a divorce? The book says that she and Ben were afraid of a formal marriage because Ben could be held responsible for John's debts and could be prosecuted for bigamy. But wasn't she already a bigamist?
Yes, well, she didn't mean to be a bigamist, inadvertent. But there's no way, it was very difficult at that time for a woman to get a divorce. It just didn't, in that time in Philadelphia, I can't speak for outside of that, but I looked into this. There were, in general, it was very difficult for a woman to get a divorce, so almost unheard of. So, marriage was considered a sacred state that could not be separated. People could not be separated by man, only by God. So she couldn't have gotten a divorce, even if she were able to prove that her husband, John Rogers, was dead or something. No way.
So I found in reading Poor Richard's Women, this is just more than just a story about a family, certainly a famous historical family indeed, but it's a story really to help us understand our founding as well. What in Poor Richard's Women do you feel you learned, or you feel you're bringing to the table in our understanding about Ben Franklin? I mean, what do we learn from Poor Richard's Women about Ben Franklin that we didn't know before?
Yes, and again, this wasn't, one writes and researches, there were surprises along the way and discoveries, which you can't predict them in the beginning. And what I discovered is, well, by the end of the book, at least for me, I understood a lot more about him as a human being. And a real human being, not just, and I extol and admire all of his accomplishments. And I love Ben. I think he's a terrific personality and character, genius. But you learn that he is very much a man who is driven by passions and struggles with prudence. His image, in his political image, certainly is one of ultimate discretion. It drives John Adams crazy. This man is taking his time, and he's socializing, and he's hobnobbing with all these people, and he's going to salons, and John Adams, wants to get in there and let's get this done. And Franklin has a different style. It's like a slow chess game. He's a great chess player, and it's a way of winning them over, engaging them, winning their trust. And then finally, we can start to begin to have discussions about what we need from the French. And that was his style. And, this is the image. And it's the image of him all the way through in other political things. A man of reason, a man of discretion, always cool, always in control. And I've discovered that wasn't really so. Yes, in fact, you can make a case, I believe, and I think he struggled with passion versus prudence privately, with his women and his natural instincts and his urges. And there's a lot of, evidence, of that. Sometimes you see it in his political writings. There are some really, invictive things that he writes that, are very violent about, in particular, the Penns, but also, about Arthur Lee. There's one letter he writes that is just, absolutely, he calls him sick and a sick mind. And this man is, paranoid, doesn't use the word paranoid, it's not invented yet, but then he won't send a letter. He then doesn't. So, okay, that's his persona, which is what comes down to us in history, is a man of ultimate reason. But I learned, at least I believe, this is a human being like the rest of us, who was always juggling his, this man had a lot of appetites, his passions and his instinct to be proper and good and all of the things that one aspires to be.
Well, as I mentioned to all, we're going to end a few minutes early here so that we can all get ourselves settled and watch Ken Burns' Ben Franklin. But before we go, I did put the link to the bookshop.org link for where you can purchase Nancy Stewart's Poor Richard's Women and her other books. If you go to historyauthortalks.com, you'll see not only the link to that bookshop, but also some of our upcoming shows, proving that Women's History Month is not just March, on Coming up, we have Following the Drum, The Women of Valley Forge. We have The Remarkable Cause, a novel written by Jean O'Connor about James Lovell. So go to historyauthortalks.com. I am the co-founder of 10crucialdays.org, which is my nonprofit. Always appreciate any donations that you want to help out with. We are historical interpreters. I really encourage everyone to purchase a copy of Poor Richard's Women. It was a wonderful read. It's an easy read. It's one of those books that you can read quickly because it's fascinating. So I really encourage everyone to go get a copy of Poor Richard's Women. And I want to thank Nancy for her time this evening. And as always, thank you all for joining me on History Author Talks. Until next time, good night, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
I know.
Bye.